This was the photo that gave police hope they might find James Bulger alive, but instead, it became one of the most haunting crime photos ever taken. In February of 1993, 2-year-old James Bulger disappeared. In the 2 seconds his mother let go of his hand in a Liverpool shopping center, and police initially felt relieved when security footage showed him leaving with 2 young boys, not an adult predator, but that relief quickly diminished as they slowly learned the horrific truth. Over the next 2 hours, 10-year-olds John Venables and Robert Thompson dragged James through back streets, kicked and punched him, threw him onto his head, smeared paint in his eye, force-fed him batteries, pelted him with bricks and stones, and beat him with a 22-pound iron bar. At one point, they tried to push him into traffic, and several witnesses later admitted they didn't intervene because they assumed James was their younger brother. Their assaults left 42 separate injuries, including multiple skull fractures so extensive pathologists couldn't determine how or when James died. The boys then placed his body across train tracks to stage an accident, and a train later severed him, destroying critical evidence and delaying the discovery of the truth. When police identified the killers, expecting a violent man, not 2 10-year-olds, veteran officers said it was the most disturbing revelation of their careers. Both were sentenced to detention and released at 18 with lifelong anonymity, but Venables has since returned to prison multiple times for child abuse material, while Thompson has not reoffended, though he spent years blaming James's mother for the horrific murder, saying she never should have let go of his hand. The results of Michael Jackson's autopsy report were nothing short of disturbing. He was largely bald with only sparse hair remaining, the result of burns and repeated cosmetic procedures, as he'd been wearing a wig in public for years. His scalp also showed scarring consistent with past injuries. He had multiple cosmetic tattoos, including permanent eyeliner and lip liner, likely done to maintain his appearance without daily makeup. His skin also showed signs of vitiligo alongside extensive cosmetic alteration. His arms were marked with numerous puncture wounds, consistent with frequent injections over time. Toxicology findings showed multiple drugs in his system and partially dissolved pills in his stomach, indicating recent ingestion. The cause of death was ruled acute propofol intoxication, a powerful surgical anesthetic. In the final months of his life, Michael was given propofol regularly inside his home to induce sleep, essentially relying on anesthesia instead of natural slumber. His personal physician, Conrad Murray, was later convicted of involuntary manslaughter for administering the drug outside of proper medical care. In March of 1998, 13-year-old Tristan Brübach left school in Frankfurt complaining of a backache and walked through the Liederbach pedestrian tunnel, a dim underpass children commonly used as a shortcut. While inside the tunnel, he was attacked and murdered in an extremely brutal assault. Investigators determined that the killer cut his throat so deeply that the wound reached his spine and nearly severed his head. After the killing, the attacker mutilated the body, removing Tristan's privates and taking them from the scene. Blood evidence suggested the killer remained in the tunnel for some time, staging the body and possibly washing himself in the nearby stream. Shortly after the murder, a man called police and calmly confessed, providing details only the killer would know. But when officers rushed to the tunnel, the caller had already disappeared. Despite decades of investigation, DNA analysis, and multiple suspects, Tristan's killer has never been identified. The Liederbach tunnel where the murder occurred was sealed off later that year and has remained closed ever since. In June of 2024, former Marine recruiter Ricardo Perez Castillo broke into a Michigan home through an unlocked side door around 3 a.m. He removed his shoes, socks, pants, and underwear, armed himself with a kitchen knife, and went upstairs. Unable to enter the locked master bedroom, he entered a children's room where an 11-year-old girl was sleeping on an air mattress during a sleepover. Castillo then tried to stab the child repeatedly in the neck, but got her shoulder instead. Her screams woke up the homeowner, who held the intruder at gunpoint until deputies arrived. Castillo later confessed he intended to kill the girl and have intercourse with her body, and then planned to murder the entire family despite having no prior connection to them. The child survived after emergency surgery but is permanently scarred for obvious reasons. On November 26, 2025, Castillo was sentenced to at least 18 years in prison and must register as a sex offender. During sentencing, the judge called the case deeply disturbing, stating the victim survived only because of the homeowner's actions and by the grace of God. This woman's crimes were so horrific that she became the first female in the history of France to receive a full life sentence. In 2022, 12-year-old Lola Daviet disappeared after school in Paris, and security footage from the apartment building where she lived with her family showed her walking inside with 27-year-old Dabia Ben-Kirid following closely behind. Hours later, Lola's body was found stuffed inside a plastic storage box in the lobby of that same building. Investigators say Ben-Kira lured the girl into her own sister's apartment, who lived upstairs, where she forced Lola to shower, taped her face, stabbed her repeatedly, and subjected her to what the judge called true torture, ultimately killing her through asphyxiation before eventually decapitating her. Ben-Kira initially confessed, then kept changing her story, and even showed complete indifference when confronted with photos of the gruesome crime. In 2025, she became the first woman in French history to receive a whole life sentence, a punishment previously reserved for only 4 men. The tragedy deepened when Lola's father died in 2024 from alcohol-related complications brought on by the grief of losing his daughter. Winona Ryder's life has been shaped by trauma long before Stranger Things. At age 12, she was beaten unconscious by classmates who thought she looked gay, leaving her with a concussion, stitches, and lasting psychological scars. Years later, while filming Alien Resurrection, she suffered a near-fatal anaphylactic shock after reacting to a chemical used on her costume. Production halted as she was rushed for emergency treatment. By the late 90s, her mental health reportedly collapsed entirely, and in 2001, she was arrested for shoplifting thousands of dollars in designer clothes. While heavily sedated on painkillers she later admitted she'd been abusing. The fallout destroyed her career for years and forced her into a long period of therapy before she slowly resurfaced in Hollywood, a period she describes today as losing myself completely. Winona later said she felt as though the world had turned on her overnight, and that the humiliation pushed her into one of the darkest depressions of her life. It took years before she finally found work again, slowly rebuilding a life she once thought might never recover. This was the shocking moment when an MLB pitcher realized his life was over. Former Red Sox pitcher Austin Maddox went from a World Series ring holder to a child predator after he was arrested in Florida in 2024. Investigators say he believed he was talking to a 14-year-old girl, unaware the teen was actually an undercover detective. When he arrived at the meeting place, officers pounced on him before he could even walk through the front door and arrested him immediately. The report says he had driven there intending to meet a teenage girl, part of a wider operation targeting child predators. Maddox was charged with multiple felonies and later sentenced to 3 years in prison, his mugshot replacing whatever was left of his brief baseball career. A man in Mantua, Italy is under investigation after police discovered he had kept his mother's corpse hidden inside their home ever since she died in 2022. He never reported her death. Instead, he placed her body in a sleeping bag in the laundry room where it eventually mummified. Over the next 3 years, he continued collecting her pension, pulling in tens of thousands of euros annually. When her ID expired in 2025, he tried to renew it by dressing up in a wig, makeup, and his late mother's clothes, hoping to pass as her. But staff grew suspicious of his deep voice and masculine features and alerted police immediately. Authorities compared photos, searched the home, and found the mummified remains, leading to charges for fraud, identity theft, and concealing a corpse. This was the moment when a Brazilian news reporter made the most horrific discovery of his life. While reporting on the disappearance of a 13-year-old girl who had recently drowned in Brazil's Miarim River, journalist Lenildo Frazão wanted to show viewers how quickly the riverbed drops off. As the cameras rolled, he jolted in shock and said he'd felt something like an arm brush against his leg. Hours later, rescue teams recovered the girl's body in that exact spot, confirming that Frazão had unknowingly stepped on her remains during the broadcast. The girl, named Raissa, had drowned after being pulled under by the river's hidden holes and strong current, and the journalist says he's now traumatized for life. This video shows a man holding his cat when he unknowingly steps on one of the deadliest animals on Earth, the eastern brown snake, the second most venomous snake in Australia, somehow slithering across his living room floor. Eastern brown snakes are so fast and defensive that a single bite can kill an adult man in minutes, causing paralysis, seizures, and cardiac collapse before help can arrive. The man is extremely lucky he stepped near the snake's head and pinned its movement, completely unaware until after watching the footage that he was only inches away from a strike that could have easily ended both his life and his cat's. Kay Letourneau became one of the most notorious teachers in American history after authorities discovered she'd formed an illegal relationship with a 12-year-old student in her class, a crime that shocked the country and completely destroyed her family. She was arrested in 1997 and sent to prison, where she gave birth to his child while still serving time. When she got out on parole, a judge ordered her to stay away from the boy entirely, but she was caught violating that order and was sent back to prison to finish a full 7-year sentence, a move prosecutors said showed how disturbingly deep her attraction to him ran. When she was finally released, the story took an even darker turn. The former student, now an adult, chose to reunite with her, and the pair eventually married in 2005 despite their relationship beginning as a felony case, described by experts as a profound abuse of power. They stayed together for over a decade before finally separating, leaving behind one of the most unsettling and controversial teacher-student scandals in recorded history. Susan King spent 6.5 years in prison for a murder she couldn't possibly have committed. She had one leg, weighed under 100 pounds, and didn't even own a car. Yet police claimed she beat, shot, and dragged a man before tossing his body off a bridge 40 miles away. The lead detective built the entire case on lies, fake ballistics, drag marks that were actually water damage, and blood evidence that never matched the victim. And investigators later admitted they had doubts about her guilt before it even went to trial. But terrified of facing life in prison or the death penalty, Susan took a plea deal and went to prison for murdering a man she never even laid her hands on. Years later, a different man confessed in detail to the murder, even describing facts never released to the public, and even claimed the same detective threatened him to stay quiet. Only then was Susan exonerated, and the state eventually paid her $750,000. The detective who framed her never faced charges. He simply retired while under investigation for unrelated sexual misconduct. Russian fitness influencer Dmitry Nuyanzin has died after collapsing during a workout, and investigators say his body had been pushed to the absolute breaking point. The 32-year-old had recently been filming a 10,000-calorie bulking challenge while still cutting water for photo shoots and reportedly cycling stimulants and anabolic agents. Friends said he'd been complaining of dizziness and chest pain but kept training to keep up the content. When he collapsed at the gym, doctors couldn't revive him, and the autopsy showed his heart was severely enlarged and overloaded, more like that of a much older man. Experts concluded he suffered sudden cardiac failure triggered by a perfect storm of extreme overeating, chemical strain, dehydration, and relentless overtraining. Nicholas Kunzelman and Stephanie Hart Grizel survived the Columbine shooting in 1999, only to be mysteriously murdered less than a year later. On February 13, 2000, Stephanie went to visit Nicholas while he was closing the Subway restaurant just a mile from their high school. Hours later, an off-duty employee noticed the lights still on, walked in, and saw an unknown young man leaving. Inside, he found both Columbine teens shot to death behind the counter. Nothing was stolen, so it wasn't a robbery, and the witness gave a detailed description of the suspect, but he was never found. Investigators later uncovered a drug ring operation out of that Subway, but there was no link to the teens. To this day, the killer has never been identified. This was the moment when officers found Marvin Morales lying unresponsive on the floor of a station bathroom. A California sheriff's deputy who just overdosed on cocaine he'd stolen from people he arrested, which later tested positive for fentanyl. Deputies had to rush in and administer Narcan to revive him, and he was fired soon afterward. But on December 2nd, 2025, Morales resurfaced in the most horrific way imaginable. That morning, he stabbed his 11-year-old son multiple times inside their own home, while the boy's 6-year-old sister hid nearby, too terrified to move. Deputies who arrived described blood pooled near the entryway, and signs the boy had tried to crawl toward the front door. Morales fled before anyone could reach him, leading to a pursuit down Interstate 5 that ended when spike strips shredded his tires. As the car crashed to a stop, he reportedly drew a weapon, forcing officers who had worked with him in the past to shoot him. Morales died hours later at the hospital, while the sheriff called the crime one of the most devastating his department had ever encountered.